Hello, I'm Meredith Miliaccio, and I'd like to welcome you to The Delight of Knitting. If this is your first time with me, I'd like to extend a personal invitation for you to get your needles and yarn and knit along with me. If you've been with me before, I'd like to thank you for inviting me back for another episode of The Delight of Knitting. We're going to use some yarn and a pair of knitting needles, and I'll show you how to turn this long piece of string into a masterpiece you can wear. Let's get started. Alright, so you've just gone to the yarn store. You have two choices of yarn usually that you can buy. The first one is called a skein, and it is yarn that has already been balled for you. All you have to do is pull out the loose end and get started. The other one is a hank, and this is not balled for you. It will open up in a big circle, and then you're going to have to ball that all for yourself. Looking at your labels, this is a number 4 weight. This means that it's about in the middle as far as the thickness goes of the type of yarn, and the washing instructions are there as well. It's really important to pay attention to, especially when working with natural fibers. They tend to shrink, and also with these dyed things, you really need to pay attention to how to care for it, because you can completely ruin your colors if you don't wash it properly. So this one, again, it also has the information about the weight of the yarn, and this shows your dye lot, which if you're working on a much larger project, you want to make sure your dye lots are all the same. That way you know that you're all getting the same colors. So the other thing we're going to use today is 2 of the double pointed bamboo knitting needles. These are a US number 5, 3.75 millimeter needle, and they are just smaller, shorter. I tend to prefer the bamboo over the metal because I think it just works better for me, but you can try out all the different types of needles and find something that you like. So to get the yarn started, you're going to pull from the inside, not the outside. Even if there's a piece of yarn that looks loose and you just don't resist. It's not worth it. Pull from the middle. You're gonna pull out this big knot. It's not really knotted, but it is kind of bunched up until you have just one single piece of yarn that is coming out. And then what you're going to do is start untangling this big mess. And I think kind of like life, this big mess of a knot that you've got to sort it out before you can get started on anything. And I think that's kind of how life goes sometimes too. We've got to work through some of the mess first, and then we can start being productive. I'm going to teach you the long tail cast on method, and what we're going to do is wrap the yarn 20 times around one of our needles. We are going to be putting 20 stitches into this project, so that's why we're going to wrap it 20 times. This will make sure that the tail of the piece of work is long enough that you can weave it in. And when we start our cast on, we're going to be using the tail end of the yarn to create our casted on stitches. To start our cast on, we're going to take the yarn in our left hand and put it in between our index finger and our middle finger. We're then going to wrap it around the back of our thumb and have it cross in front. Hold it with your other fingers just so it's a little bit tight. Stick the needle through the hole on your thumb, and then grab the yarn from your first finger, your index finger, and pull it through. Pull it tight, but not too tight. You don't want it to be so tight that you can't work the stitch, but you do want it to be snug enough that it's not going to go anywhere. So again, in between the first finger and the middle finger. Now, that's the first cast on. Now we are going to be adding on stitches. So we're going to use the tail end of the yarn. That's what's going to wrap around your thumb, and the working yarn from the skein is going to go in between your first finger and your middle finger. First finger and middle finger. Thumb gets wrapped around the back. And then use your ring finger and your pinky to kind of hold that yarn tight. So you see we have like a little bit of an upside down triangle here. So I'll show you one more time. We've got the working yarn off to the left, the tail yarn at the bottom. Put it in between your first finger, middle finger, wrap it around the back of your thumb. Use your other fingers to hold it tight, and now we're ready. Now pick up the yarn from the front into the middle, and then from the first finger, and pull it back around into that center hole. So now that's one stitch that we have casted on with our tail. Let's do it again. We're going to do 20 of these in total. So we have 2, again, from the thumb, from the first finger, back through the thumb, let your thumb go, and pull it tight. Not so tight that it can't move, but tight enough that it's not going to go anywhere. So we have our 20 stitches on our needle, and we have one needle that doesn't have anything. And essentially what you're doing is transferring the stitches from one needle to the next needle. Every time that you complete a stitch, you're going to move it over to the new needle. So hold the working one in your right hand, use the one that has all the stitches on it in your left. Put the needle from front to back, crossing in the back. This is going to be for a knit stitch. Then hold the needle slightly while you get your yarn in your other hand. Make sure that you're grabbing the working yarn and not the tail yarn. I like to hold my yarn this way, but you can hold it however you like. This just gives me control, and this is what's most comfortable for me. So again, we're going to put the needle in that first loop and have it cross to the back. And then we're going to loop our working yarn around that needle, and we're going to pull it back through this other loop so that it pops out on the other side. Then slowly and carefully pull that stitch off of the needle and transfer it over to the other one. Now this first row, I will tell you, is extremely tight. You just cast it on. It's hard to work. I have been knitting for years, and this first establishing row is always difficult. So please be patient with yourself and be kind. It's frustrating, but I promise you the rest of the project will be a lot easier. So again, you're going to put the needle into the back, hook that yarn, transfer the stitch over to the other needle. It sometimes helps in the beginning to kind of hold the yarn with the first finger on your right hand when you're doing this, just so that it doesn't slip off. If it does slip off, that stitch will need to be picked back up. In this establishing row, it's difficult to do, so I would suggest you just take extra time to get this done properly so that you don't have to do that. Depending on how many stitches it is, you probably would have to pull out the whole thing and start over again, because it is the cast on row. It's a little bit harder to fix. This whole row, 20 stitches, we're going to work 20 knit stitches, and it all goes the same way until you run out of stitches. Okay, here I ended up transferring a stitch without actually working it. So all I'm going to do is just move it back to the other needle and knit it like I would any other. Don't worry, it happens. Alright, so now we're going to purl. We have turned our work, and now we're going to work the back side of the work. So in the knit stitch, we go into the back, we loop, and then we pull it through. The purl stitch is pretty much the same stitch, but in reverse. sort of. So what we're going to do is we're going to pull our working yarn towards the front of our work. I like to hold mine with my thumb out of the way there so that I can see where I'm putting my needle. We're going to put the needle into the stitch and cross it in the front this time. And then we are also going to wrap the yarn around the needle, pull it back with our thumb slightly so that there's a little bit of tension on it, pull it through the loop, and then slide it off of the needle just like you would with the knit stitch. We're going to go ahead and purl the rest of the row, and while we're doing that, I will share with you my love of knitting. I grew up knitting. My mother was a knitter, and so was her mother, and so on and so forth. It is one of those things that the women in my family have done for generations, and every time I knit, I am knitting in the stitches and the styles that I learned how to knit from my mother, who learned from her mother, who learned from her mother, so on and so forth. And so it really connects me to the women in my family as far back as time goes, and nobody knows where that first knitter popped up, but she did, and I'm grateful that she did because I get so much joy from knitting. Not only is it peaceful, it is very grounding and meditative. So after a long day, I like to sit down and knit. It helps me calm down. It helps me think more clearly. Not only that, when I'm finished with a project, I can either wear it myself and take great pride in the work that I did, or it's going to go to somebody that I love and give them warmth and love and joy. And so it's one of those things that it's a joy to make, and it's a joy to wear, and it's a joy to gift. So I would definitely recommend knitting for anybody who is interested in it. It is a wonderful hobby. Okay, so we're going to start the cast off. We are going to do this on the right side of the work instead of the wrong side. So it's going to be on the knit side of the work. And what you're going to do is start off by knitting the first stitch, the same as you have been this whole time. We're going to knit the first stitch. Then we're going to knit the second stitch. There are multiple cast-offs. This is the easiest. And then what you're going to do is take the loop from that first stitch and pull it over top of that other stitch. Pull it through, and now you just have one stitch left on your needle. Slide that other one off and it will hold. So you always have the first stitch, you make a second stitch, and then you pull the first one over top of the second one. And you're going to do this all the way across the row until you have just one stitch left. So we're casting off here, and we're going to go across the whole row. I think the casting off process is fun for me. It means that I have finished the project. It means that my hard work is just about to pay off. There's still a couple things left to do before you can say this project is officially finished, but this means that we're getting very close. I like to think of the cast off process as like the last couple weeks of the semester. You're so close to being done, but you just have to get through those final exams. And so the final exams for me is kind of in the knitting project, the weaving in portion, which we're going to get into here in just a second. You've cast it off, you have one stitch left, and here's what you do with it. You pull it out a little bit so that there's some slack, and then what you're going to do is cut your yarn. Congratulations, you have made it to this point. cut your yarn, give yourself enough of a tail so that you can work with it, and then you're just going to pull it through the loop and knot it just like you would anything else. Just knot it up and then it's done. Alright, so we've made it to the weaving in stage. You're going to get yourself a tapestry needle or just really any large needle. You can find them in the knitting section, but it's got to be big enough to hold the yarn. And what you're going to do is you're going to take this tail end and you're going to weave it into each one of these little loops nearby. You can be random. There is no method to this, really. You do want it to be nice and neat, and you don't want to pull too tight on it. Every now and then, it's a good idea to kind of check the front of the work and make sure that you're not doing anything where it's going to show. So here I'm just checking to make sure that I'm indeed burying the thread where it needs to be so that it's not going to show through the front. And you're going to work through it a few times, just kind of get it randomly worked into the back of these stitches. And then you're going to start going up and down, zigzagging, just kind of all over the place. The more of the tail that is buried and randomly hidden throughout this, the less likely that it is for it to come apart. And then once you think you've got a good enough portion of the tail buried, you're going to start going back through some of the same loops that you went through and doubling back on it. And that's it, you're all done. Thank you so much for joining me today. I had so much fun teaching you how to knit, and I hope that you pick up this hobby and that you find as much enjoyment from it as I do. Until next time, God bless. Bye-bye.